I'm going to show you how to make REST API calls to Aria Automation. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Brian Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place.
This is part 9 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. In parts 1 through 8, we took a generic look at how to make REST API calls. But now, in parts 9 and onwards, we're going to take a look at specific VMware products. In part 9, we're going to be taking a look at how to make REST API calls to VMware Aria Automation.
Congratulations! You have persevered through all the preceding videos, and now we actually start to do the kinds of things that you probably wanted to do with the REST API all along. Specifically, what we're going to be doing in this video and the next few videos is using the Aria Automation REST API to work with blueprints. Now, to start us off here, let me make abundantly clear here that what used to be called blueprints were then renamed cloud templates, and nowadays they're called Aria Automation templates. The names changed multiple times, but in the API documentation, they're still called blueprints. So I'm going to stick mostly with that term. But if I say cloud templates or Aria Automation templates, I mean the same thing. All right, so to kick things off here, as you can see over in our blueprints folder, I've created numerous different REST requests that we're going to be talking about in this video and the next video. In this video, we're going to start talking about how to get information about the blueprints that are in your VRA server. And additionally, we're going to learn how to get information about a particular blueprint by its blueprint ID or by its name. But before we start any of this, we need some blueprints to work with. Now, to help you out here, I've created 3 blueprints and I've uploaded the code for them to my GitLab repository. If you'd like to use your own blueprints, you can make substitutions in the steps that I'm going to take later on. On the other hand, if you'd like to download my blueprints, let's see where to do that. So to do that, we're going to go to good old gitlab.com/brianwatrous/VVork. And in here, there's a folder titled YouTube. In the YouTube folder, there's a folder titled Making REST API Calls. And in there, there's a folder called Cloud Templates, formerly known as Blueprints. So let's go into the Cloud Templates folder. And as you can see here, I have the YAML code for 3 different blueprints. All 3 blueprints are going to deploy a CentOS VM, but there are some minor differences between these 3 blueprints. So we need to download these. You're probably tempted to click on this button here, but that's going to download everything. That's not what we want. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to, I right click and I'll just open each of these in their own separate tab. And then going to each of these tabs, we'll just say that we want to download this one. We'll save it into our downloads folder. I'll do the same thing for the next blueprint. And then one more time for the final blueprint. So get yourself these 3 blueprints downloaded into your environment. So that's all we need to do in GitLab. But what we need to do next is to go over to Aria Automation and import those blueprints. So I'm going to log in. I'll log in as eng-ca-admin using the super secret password. I'll sign in, and to import these, I'm going to first of all go into Cloud Assembly. In Aria Automation, this is actually called Assembler, but whether you go into Cloud Assembly or Assembler, it's going to take you to a screen that looks basically like this. In the Design section, under Cloud Templates, you can see all the cloud templates that we currently have. Right now there's 23, and we're just about to import 3 more. So to import the 3 new cloud templates, we're going to go to New From, and I've been using the term import. Here they use the word upload. Whatever you want to use, we need to click here. And in here, we're going to give each cloud template a name. They're all called the same thing, so I'm going to, with a slight change in the name, so I'm going to copy this. I'm going to pick a project. I'll pick my engineering project, and I'll browse to the first of our 3 files. So in Downloads, here is my first cloud template, also known as a blueprint. we'll upload that one, and then I'm going to do the same thing for the next two. So we'll go to new from, upload. The next one we'll do will be a blueprint that is intentionally broken. I'll show you how here shortly in the next video or so. Again, we'll browse to our broken blueprint, and then we'll browse to a blueprint that is designed to ask the user who's using this blueprint to specify some input values. All right, so one last one. This is inputs, and we got all three now. So as you can see in Aria Automation, I now have 26 different cloud templates. Let's go back to Postman, and in Postman, let's start working with these different REST requests, starting with get all blueprints. Now, the definition of this REST request says to use the endpoint URL blueprint/API/blueprints, and then this tail end portion you'll recognize is specifying which version of the VRA API we want to use. So the key part in this here is blueprint/API/blueprints. How did I know to use that endpoint URL? How did I know what the URL was? Well, you know from previous videos that we could go to developer.vmware.com/APIs, and in there is a API called the vRealize Automation Blueprint API. That's exactly the sort of thing that we want here. So I'm going to go into there, and in here you'll see there are different categories. The two categories you need to know in particular are these two: blueprint versus blueprint requests. Blueprint has a number of different operations that you can perform. The first thing that we're going to do is get blueprint API blueprints, which is exactly what we just saw in Postman. The point of that is to list all the blueprints. If we expand this here, you'll notice that like many other operations in our REST API, there are a number of different query parameters that we can specify to be specific about exactly what we're looking for. In particular, we're going to be talking here in a moment about skip and top. But for right now, let's ignore those. Another place that you could go to find out information about not just this REST request and its endpoint URL, but all the other REST requests that we could do related to blueprints is to go into the Automation programming API programming guide. I'm going to be using 8.13 in this video. I'll put a link to that in the YouTube description. I happen to recall, if we go to page 26, that there is information here about how to do things like create a machine through the API using a blueprint. And we're going to be talking about that, but not just yet, not in this video. I promise we'll get there very shortly, but not this video. In the meantime, if you just can't wait till the video after this comes out, this would be a great place for you to start looking at next. But for now, let's go back to the API documentation. Let me collapse this here and point out that we can also do things such as create a blueprint. So whereas get blueprint API blueprints lists blueprints, post is used to create new blueprints. And we can find out information about a specific blueprint. So whereas this URL is going to get all information about all the blueprints, this one will allow us to look up a specific blueprint. We can update blueprints, we can delete them, and there's a bunch of other things that we can do, including if you have versions of blueprints, you can go out and target specific versions. But for our purposes right now, we're going to keep things a bit simple here. We're going to go back to Postman, and in Postman, as you can see, we've got our endpoint URL. As far as the body, you'll notice that there's no body here. So let's go ahead and actually send this REST request and see what happens. First thing I check is the status code. We've got a Series 200 code, which is good. And we've got a whole bunch of information here. In fact, there's so much. I'm going to go ahead and copy this information, and we'll take it over to Notepad++. I'll paste it in, and then either going to the plugin menu or going here, or I'm just going to use key sequences. Let's see. So Control-Alt-P to make it pretty, Control-Alt-J to open up the JSON tree viewer, and Alt-0 will collapse the JSON formatted data over here. All right, so what did we get? Well, let's take a look. If we look at the tree viewer, you'll notice that there are a whole bunch of items here. We're going to talk about content. That's the main place that you want to go. But there are all these other items here that primarily have to do with the paging capabilities of the REST API. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But let's start by going into the array called content. This content array has 20 entries in it, 0 through 19. Each of these entries corresponds to one of the blueprints in my VRA server. Now, you'll notice here again that there are 20, but you'll recall over in vRealize Automation, we saw that my VRA server actually has 26 different blueprints. So you are quite possibly asking yourself right now, why don't I see all 26? Well, the short answer to that is that the REST API by default only returns 20 blueprints. Now we can modify that behavior. I'll show you how in a moment, but by default, you're only going to see 20 blueprints. If you want to see the next 20 blueprints, you're going to need to modify the URL, the endpoint URL, by specifying some query parameters, which again, we'll talk about in a moment. But let's keep things simple right now and take a look at the first entry in this array. So when we expand here, we see lots of information about a specific blueprint, including we can see things such as when it was created, we can see who created it, we can see a description of that blueprint. Remember how I imported the blueprints? I didn't specify any descriptions, which is why this is blank. If the blueprint had a description, it would show up here. I can see the ID of the blueprint. The REST API provides one way of looking up blueprint IDs. We'll talk about some others here in a moment, but that's one way you can get the ID of a specific blueprint. Name, as I'm sure you've already figured out, is telling us the name of this specific blueprint. So you'll recall we imported 3 blueprints, VVork, CentOS, VVork, CentOS broken, and this one here, VVork-CentOS-inputs. We can see what organization this blueprint is associated with. We can see the project ID that the blueprint is associated with. We can see the name of the project, and so forth. Additionally, we can see things such as any validation messages. We're going to talk about validating blueprints here in the next video. But right now, as you can see, we've got a wealth of information about this blueprint and all of, well, not all, but the first 20 blueprints. So let's look at the next one. I'm going to expand the content array looking at element 1. And as you can see, element 1 is for our cloud template, our blueprint called VVork-CentOS-broken. And it has its own unique ID. If we expand element 2, our third cloud template is the one called VVork-CentOS. And again, that cloud template, that blueprint has its own ID. Now, the reason why I keep emphasizing the blueprint ID is if you want to test a blueprint or you want to do a deployment from a blueprint, you need to know the blueprint ID. If you're using the REST API, you don't get to say, I want to do a deployment from a blueprint called, and then say its name. That's not how the API works. The REST API insists that you specify the ID of the blueprint that you want to work with. So as you can see, we've got loads of information. Again, whether you want to look at that in the tree viewer, or perhaps you want to come over here and look, we've got loads of information about the first 20 blueprints. All right, let's explore the paging capability in more detail. Let me collapse things back here again. Again, you'll recall that the content array contains the information from each of the, by default, 20 different blueprints. But what if you only wanted to look at 5 blueprints? Well, to do that, we can go over to Postman and slightly modify our URL to say and $top equals 5. that will return 5 blueprints. Let's test that out. So we'll click send. We got back a 200. I'm just going to go straight to the copy button, go back to Notepad++, paste in, and again, Control-Alt-Shift-P, Control-Alt-Shift-J. Over here, you can see now that the content array has 5 entries instead of 20. Again, $top equals 5 means I only want to see the top, or I only want to see 5 blueprints. But how did I know that? Well, if you're watching closely before, you'll recall that when we were looking at the API documentation, specifically when we were looking at this, or for that matter, lots of operations behave this way, but we saw when we looked at this operation that it has various parameters we can set, query parameters such as $top. Another one that you might be interested in is $skip. In order to see what that one does, let me point out here, if we look at our 5 that we got here, notice that once again, let me go backwards here. The third one is VVork-CentOS. The second one is VVork-CentOS broken, and the first one is VVork-CentOS-inputs. But we're going to change the URL slightly here by adding and $skip equals, why don't we say 1? We'll go ahead and send this. We'll copy it. We'll go over to Notepad++. We'll paste it in. We'll do Control-Shift-P, Control-Shift-J. Again, because I said $top equals 5, the content array still has 5 entries, but notice this time that instead of VVork-CentOS-inputs being the first entry here, that one's no longer showing up because we skipped that one. So the very first blueprint in our array is now VVork-CentOS-broken. Our second will be VVork-CentOS. Where is it? There's VVork-CentOS. And the third one is not going to be VVork-CentOS anything anymore. It's going to be some other blueprint. In this case, a blueprint called Nginx Beacon Cloud Template, blah, blah, blah. So again, that's a quick introduction into the paging capabilities of the REST API. Again, I'm showing you the paging capabilities in the context of looking up blueprints, but there are lots of REST operations in our API that allow you to do paging. And again, speaking of paging, when you see things like size 5 and skip and so forth, information that you see here is largely related to paging. For example, total pages 6 means that if you're using a size of 5, well, let's see, 26 divided by 5 would be, you need 6 pages to see all 26 different blueprints. I'll let you do the math on that one. Just trust me. All right, let's take a look at one more thing about this first of our 3 REST requests that we're looking at in this video. So again, back to get all blueprints. I'd like to point out to you here that I am running some post request scripts. You know that those show up here on the test tab. What you can see me doing here, which is very similar to what we've seen in previous videos. Line number 1 is setting up a variable called data. Data is going to hold the response body, so all this information, but not just as a raw string as we see here, but line number 1 says parse that up. It's JSON. Parse it up into its different components so that we can pick out the pieces we want. For example, later on line 2, when we say data.content0, well, again, you note that the response body has that content array. 0 means go look at the first element in that array, and .id would get this piece of information right here. So what line number 3 is doing in this particular example is saving the blueprint ID of whatever happens to be the very first blueprint that shows up in our array. Now, I'm going to run this one more time. I'm going to get rid of that query string. I'm going to run this one more time. And notice that the blueprint ID of the very first blueprint, out of all 20 here, the very first blueprint's ID ends in 8994. And if we go look at our VVork environments, the blueprint underscore ID Postman variable is that ID, 8994. All right, so armed with that information, let's go take a look at our next REST request called get1blueprint by blueprintId. Now, you'll recall, just moments ago, I told you that the previous REST request saved a blueprint ID in the Postman variable called blueprint underscore ID, which is what you can see us using right here. So blueprint underscore ID, in this case, see if we get a tooltip here, you'll notice ends in 8994. So if you recall, our previous REST request essentially had this as its endpoint URL. It also had the business at the end about API version, but the core of the endpoint URL for the previous request ended in blueprint/API/blueprints. In this request, we're adding to the URL a blueprint ID, which causes this very similar looking URL to behave in a slightly different way. Whereas if you just say blueprint API blueprints without a blueprint ID, you're going to get terse information about all the blueprints, or at least 20 at a time by default. If you add a blueprint ID, you're going to get detailed information about this one specific blueprint. So with that explanation, let's click the send button and see what happens. So when we click the send button, you can see we've gotten back much the same type of information. So for example, once again, we can see the name of the project that this blueprint is associated with. We can see the project ID. We can see what org it belongs to. We can see who created this blueprint, when they created it. We can see the name of the blueprint and its description if it had one. But notice here that content, when you do this operation, content is not that array that we saw before. This is not an array. This is not an array of blueprints. With this REST operation, content is a string. And you might want to hit pause and see if you recognize what this string is. The string, starting right here, is the YAML code associated with this specific blueprint. So not only do you see all this information about the blueprint, you can see its actual YAML code. Now the YAML code looks perhaps a little bit weird here. Let's actually go look at the blueprint the way you would ordinarily see it. So ordinarily, if you're looking at a blueprint like this one here, you're accustomed to seeing the YAML code look like this. It's nicely indented, it's multiple lines, it's easy to read. On the other hand, when you look at the content property in our response body, it's the same YAML code, but it's showing up as a single string. Now, forgive me if you already know this. Most of you, I'm certain, already do. But \n is a new line. So if you were to take this raw string, this YAML code, and substitute \n with actual new lines, that would result in exactly what we see over here. So this second REST operation is useful when you want to get details about a specific blueprint. The third REST request that we're going to look at here is very similar, except this time we're not going to look up using the blueprint ID of the blueprint that we're interested in. Instead, we're going to specify it by name. Now again, the core of this URL looks largely the same as what we've seen previously, but notice we're not adding / followed by the blueprint ID the way we did in the previous REST request. Instead, for this operation, the way you specify the name of the blueprint that you're interested in is through a query string. So you just add and name equals, and then whichever blueprint you are interested in. So let's go ahead and send this request. And as you can see, when you send that request with this operation, you get back essentially the same type of message again. In the case of searching by name, you do not get the YAML code for the blueprint. If you want the YAML code for the blueprint, you're going to have to use the second REST request. All right, let's take a quick look here. Is there anything in the body for this one? Nope. Are there any special things I'm doing? Well, yes, once again, if I'm not mistaken, for all three of these requests, if I'm not mistaken, in all three cases, my test tab JavaScript code is saving the blueprint ID of whatever we happen to look up. Because soon here, what we're going to want to do, once we have the ability to look up blueprint IDs, is to use those blueprint IDs to do things like validate a blueprint. You know, when you're in the Aria Automation GUI, you're looking at a blueprint and you click the validate button. Actually, it's labeled the test button. We can do that, but you have to have the blueprint ID. Or if you want to do a deployment from a blueprint, you have to have the blueprint ID. So we spent a good chunk of time here in this particular video setting us up for success in the next video. In the next video, we're going to start doing things with these blueprints.
Join me in the next video and we'll continue looking at the Aria Automation API.